So self-esteem So, self esteem is a person's overall sense of worth and well being. And there have been a ton of longitudinal studies of self esteem, meaning studies that take place over a period of time instead of all at once. So, these would follow participants from childhood to adolescence or from adolescence through emerging adulthood. And these studies generally find that self esteem declines in early adolescence, around junior high, then rises in late adolescence at the end of high school. And it also rises in emerging adulthood into your early 20s. Why? I mean, yeah, we know adolescence is typically a stressful time. It's a difficult time for a lot of people. A lot going on. There's a lot of development that takes place in a pretty short period of time. But why does a person's self-esteem usually experience a drop like this during this period? Well, in a previous chapter, your textbook talked about the imaginary audience, and I did as well. The belief that others are acutely aware of and attentive to one's appearance and behavior. Because an adolescent thinks so much about themselves, because they're so self-focused and are so acutely, intensely aware of how they might appear to others, they conclude on some level that other people are thinking about them in the same way with the same amount of effort. They assume that others are thinking about them as much as they are thinking about themselves. The imaginary audience makes adolescents much more self-conscious than they were when they were younger. And this is much more intense in adolescence. So an adolescent's imaginary audience makes it seem as though everybody's paying closer attention to anything and everything about them. And this causes their stress level to be higher, their anxiety is much higher, and the perceived humiliation of anything they think might be embarrassing is much more intense and it lasts longer. Now, most studies in self-esteem in adolescents assume that high self-esteem is good and low self-esteem is a problem that needs to be fixed. This is one of those things where you wonder, is there really research needed to determine this? Sometimes I'll be driving to work in the morning, and if it's at the right time, the news will be on, and they always have some not really news related item at the end of the news and say, a study out of Washington says that when it rains, it's wet outside, or just something that's so glaringly obvious. And I'll think, did that really need to research? So yes, most studies on self-esteem indicate that high self-esteem is better. But remember, this depends on the kind of culture you live in. We are used to our own norm. So adolescents in Western societies value high self-esteem, and their parents do for them. And I can tell you as a parent, I'm not just aware of my son's self-perceptions or the daughters of my partner, I'm actively aware of how they think about themselves, how they feel about themselves. So when I go to parent-teacher interviews, I'm not just asking questions about how he's doing academically. I also specifically ask, how does he fit in socially? Does he seem to get along with the other kids okay? Do other kids seem to get along with him? Does he seem to be happy or stressed all the time? But of course, I teach about this, so I'm more focused on it. Other cultures are different. For example, in traditional Asian culture, self-criticism is a virtue, and high self-esteem is generally viewed as a character flaw. In the US, a concern with self-esteem and awareness of self-esteem is a very, very strong part of American individualism that's widely considered very positively. So it's not just a stereotype that focus on the self, and concern about maintaining one's self-esteem is especially important in the US because research has consistently showed this is true. But even within the United States, though, there's going to be differences between ethnic groups. For example, I don't know why, but I guess I just think that you would think that African Americans would have more difficulty with self-esteem after being subjected to centuries of slavery and discrimination and racism and having to fight to overcome those. Having to actively fight and work to change their situation is significant because it wasn't just the way society was. Society was that way because other people were active in keeping it that way. And there is continued discrimination and racism because of these. But research has indicated that African Americans actually tend to have higher self-esteem than other ethnic groups. And this increases from childhood through adolescence into emerging adulthood. Why? I have no idea. I think it would be really interesting to research. Does the tendency for higher self-esteem of African Americans relate in some way to the historical need to always have to assert oneself because of the societal norm of being considered less than? So maintaining a better sense of self-worth was an actual active necessity for survival. Is it in some way connected to African heritage? We don't know. Research also indicates that Caucasian adolescents in the United States tend to have higher self-esteem than Latinos, Asian Americans, or Native Americans. And again, why? Why does their self-esteem tend to be higher? And why does the self-esteem of others tend to be lower? Asian Americans are often lowest in studies that compare the self-esteem of adolescents of different ethnic groups. Why? Now, I think most of you have all been talked to about this idea of self-esteem since you're in elementary school. You know, first in regards to yourself and wanting to maintain a positive evaluation of yourself. And as you get older in relation to others, this is not a new concept by any stretch. But I want you to think of it in more than one way. I want you to recognize that self-esteem is not something that's made up of one singular layer. There's different parts to it. Morris Rosenberg developed what came to be known as the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale, the RSES. And this has been used very, very widely. So the self-esteem assessment here, this is his actual self-esteem scale. So you see 10 items. Some are positively worded, some are negatively worded. And he originally administered this to a sample of 5,024 high school juniors and seniors from 10 randomly selected schools in New York State. Now, I just want to point out, this is a really, really good sample size. This is quite a large study, and so that's positive. And he administered it in 10 different schools, which is also very positive. I think really the only thing you could kind of pick at is that it was only in New York State, so maybe this would be different in different parts of the country. And using this scale, he distinguished between what he called baseline self-esteem and barometric self-esteem. Everybody has a baseline self-esteem. So this is like the base level. People with a high baseline self-esteem, they might occasionally have a bad day where they feel kind of incompetent or self-critical or whatever. They might even have a couple days like that. But for the most part, they tend to evaluate themselves positively. Not perfectly, but pretty consistently in a positive manner. So like I said, this doesn't mean they walk around most days feeling really awesome, but they usually generally have a good feeling about themselves. In contrast, people with low baseline self-esteem generally feel pretty negatively about themselves most of the time. They might have some days when they feel better, but for the most part, consistently, they simply do not have good self-esteem for whatever reason. They feel fairly negatively about themselves most of the time. This is your baseline self-esteem. When your self-esteem fluctuates, Rosenberg calls this barometric self-esteem. The fluctuating sense of worth and well-being people have as they respond to different thoughts, experiences, and interactions in the course of the day. So your barometric self-esteem is how it goes up and down. And I think most people would recognize that this is something that moves around a lot in adolescence. It moves around for everybody, no matter what your age. But in adolescence, it moves around a lot more intensely, more often. Sometimes up and down, left and right, circular, square, triangular, any way you want to put it, several times a day. And Rosenberg said, to put it in a more academic way, during adolescence, a person's barometric self-esteem is especially intense. During adolescence, a person's feelings about themselves can seem to be all over the place. Some days they feel really good, they're in a really good mood. The next day, or even the same day at a different time, they don't feel good at all. An adolescent might have a disagreement with a parent over breakfast, and feel miserable. They go to school and have some fun with friends before classes start, and they feel good. So their mood and their self-evaluation does a complete turnaround. Then they get a test back in math that they really studied for with a poor grade that has to be signed with their parents. They don't feel very smart. They get a smile from an attractive potential love interest and feel good about themselves. They're bawled out in class for talking too much, feel bad again. And this takes place all within a few hours. And it's like this the next day and the next and the next. Remember those mood swings. Everyone's adolescence is not like this. We can't say this is the absolute norm, but it's certainly not unusual in any way. Now, a really neat way of confirming this research is called the Experience Sampling Method, or ESM studies. I'm not somebody who's terribly interested in how research is conducted. The research methods courses I took, I did so because they were mandatory, and that's the only reason. But this ESM is really neat. What it does is when somebody's participating in this research, they have to report back regularly in the moment. So it used to be you'd wear a beeper watch and they'd have to record their moods and activities when beeped at certain times. Again, showing my age, talking about beepers. ESM studies are also referred to as the daily diary method or ecological momentary assessment. I prefer experience sampling method. Now, this is a longitudinal method because it takes place over time, not just all at once, and it's pretty intensive. And what it does is it involves asking the people participating to report on their thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and or environment on multiple occasions over time. So they report either immediately in the moment by writing something down, sending an email. Cell phones make this so much easier. You just send off a quick update or you fill out a form really quick. As I said in the past, they would be given a beeper watch and they'd have to maybe write something down on paper, like in a journal. Sometimes they'd have a psychometric scale, and all that means is they have a scale and they have to choose something from 1 to 10 or choose something from 1 to 4. Maybe it includes open-ended questions or anything else used to assess their feelings in that place and time. And like I said, these days with cell phones, these, which are, you know what a cell phone is, makes it really easy. So it prompts you to respond in the moment, which is even better than waiting to write down feelings manually. So what this experience sampling method did for Rosenberg was it confirmed his thoughts, his predictions about the self-esteem of adolescents, because it showed how rapid the fluctuations of their moods occurred. In a typical day, just a normal everyday day. Sorry, I know that's poor grammar. So in other words, during adolescence, it confirmed for him that their barometric self-esteem goes up and down a lot, really quickly, really intensely. And ESM studies also find that adults and pre-adolescents, yeah, they experience barometric self-esteem as well, but not with this level of intensity. Now, to add another layer to this, other studies that have built on Rosenberg's have clearly identified that part of what affects an adolescent's self-esteem is who they're with. And they can then kind of compile this information and come to conclusions. How their barometric self-esteem is affected, whether they are at school or at home, interacting with parents, interacting with friends, that sort of thing. Now, coming yet again to Susan Harder, she tried to figure out exactly what components of self-thought or self-perception contribute to how an adolescent thinks about themselves. It's okay, you have your self-concept, you have your self-esteem, but exactly what issues are important for adolescents when it comes to the effect on their self-esteem. And she identified 8 domains or 8 things. So scholastic competence, how well they're doing in school. Social acceptance, that would probably refer to their peers. athletic competence, physical appearance, job competence, romantic appeal. So note that social acceptance is different from romantic appeal, behavioral conduct, and close friendship. So Harder said these are the specific issues that are going to affect an adolescent self-esteem. But what I really want you to latch on to with Harder's research is that she says that adolescents do not need to feel positively about all of these to have high global self-esteem, which is the term she uses for overall self-esteem. Because for all adolescents, all 8 domains are not equally important. So each of these will only influence an adolescent's global self-esteem to the extent that the adolescent considers that domain important. So if somebody views themselves as having low athletic competence, and to them they'd really like to be good at athletics, then that's going to have an effect on their self-esteem because it's important to them. But if somebody has low athletic competence and they couldn't care less, they just have no interest in athletics, their family doesn't, whatever, it's simply not going to bother them very much, and it's not going to have a significant effect on their global self-esteem. And you could go through each of these. Now, it is only if that domain is important to them that it's going to have much of an effect. Although some domains are more important than others, to most adolescents, looking at Harder's 8 aspects of self-image, the most important ones are physical appearance and social acceptance from peers. And I don't think that's shocking to any of us. Speaking of physical appearance, it's not just a myth that adolescent girls are more likely than boys to focus on their physical appearance and to emphasize this, therefore, as the basis of their self-esteem more than boys do. So this doesn't mean that it doesn't matter to boys or that for some boys, physical appearance isn't really important. Remember, there's always an exception to the rule. But overall, adolescent girls are much more likely to focus on their physical appearance than adolescent boys. How they look, or if we want to be more specific, at least how they think they look to others, to their imaginary audience, will be really significant in how they evaluate themselves and thus what the status is of their self-esteem. So remember, it's not necessarily how they really appear in reality. It's all about how they think they look to others, how they feel they look to others, and therefore how they think others are thinking about them, which is why pictures like this are very specific and very relevant. So clearly this girl is very slim, but she sees herself as not being slim, and therefore she thinks other people see her as not being slim. So this gender difference, girls paying more attention to their physical appearance than boys do to theirs, is thought to largely explain gender differences in self-esteem in most Western cultures that occurs in adolescence. So unfortunately, it's not a myth that girls typically have more difficulty with body image than boys. In Western societies, it is true that girls tend to be less satisfied with the shape of their bodies than boys. It's true that girls tend to be more focused on their weight. It's true that adolescent girls in Western societies tend to evaluate their physical appearance negatively more. This is true for the majority, not everybody, but the majority. So to make a connection here, starting puberty means starting menstruation, which is perceived as positive. But with this becoming more womanly in appearance, it also means gaining weight in certain places, which goes against the Western ideal for a woman to be very thin. And this brings us back to the actual self and the ideal self, and maybe the feared self as well. Girls compare their own bodies to the cultural ideals they are surrounded with, the physical ideals they are told everyone should strive for. And if they find themselves lacking in some way, or just think they're lacking in some way, whether they are truly lacking or not, as a result of this, it's almost like dissatisfaction with the body for girls is expected at some point. That's not unusual at all. That's totally normal. Having a really unfavorable reaction to your own physical attractiveness is considered normal. Nitpicking, regularly finding fault. Many girls are truly terrified of being fat. And using the word terrified is not an overstatement at all. It's not being dramatic, because they're very aware of what the cultural standards are dictating what it means to be beautiful, what the generally accepted and expected standard of beauty is. At early ages, girls hear the remarks made about heavier girls in the halls of their schools, on TV, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, social media, jokes and comments and rude remarks. So sometimes it feels like nobody's thin enough. As a result of this, as a result of the guilt they feel about how they look, and sometimes real shame about their bodies, they constantly seek ways to improve themselves and potentially live up to those standards of beauty. It really does seem almost normal for girls to be constantly worrying about their weight, to diet, to be counting calories and measuring fat grams and not taking in too many carbs. Now, here's the thing though. Research has found that a decline in girls' self-esteem in adolescence appears to be mainly for Caucasian adolescents. So all along, I've talked about cultural differences regarding adolescence. Those cultural differences can occur in the same country. Evidence indicates that African American girls evaluate their physical appearance quite differently than Caucasian girls do. In one study indicated in your textbook of middle school and high school girls, 40% of the African American girls were satisfied with their bodies, compared with just half of that of the Caucasian girls. And it's interesting, isn't it, that there seems to be a pattern, ethnically speaking, regarding how young women think about themselves. And it isn't just weight. For African American women and Asian women, research suggests that they evaluate themselves according to skin color as well. That there's a very strong ethnic preference for lighter toned skin. If their skin is lighter, they have a more positive perception of themselves, and they have a more positive evaluation of other people with lighter skin. So usually in any discussion of adolescence and self-esteem issues, we focus almost completely on peer groups and friends, right? How your friends affect you, and that's it. But it really isn't just peer groups that can have a really significant effect on a person's sense of self in adolescence. Parents continue to be very important. This might surprise you a bit because, as I said, usually we focus on how adolescents pull away from their parents and they're becoming more independent. And yes, because peers become especially prominent in the social world of adolescents, peers have an enormous effect on an adolescent. We're going to talk about that in a separate chapter. But parents do continue to be very, very important as well. Yes, adolescents are going to spend less time with their parents and often, not always, but often have more conflict with them during this stage of life. But their parents and their relationship with their parents continues to be really, really important. Parental approval continues to be very important. And it's just common sense. If a young person has parents that provide love and positive reinforcement and support, then for a young person at this stage of life, it's probably going to have a positive effect on their self-esteem. And if parents are demeaning or belittling or just uninterested in them, kind of indifferent, that's likely going to have a negative effect on their self-esteem. Even in adolescence, with peers becoming more central to them, a young person's parents continue to remain very important, as do adults outside of the family, like coaches and tutors, and yes, teachers at school as well. Now, how exactly does self-esteem affect how an adolescent performs in school? Or does it even have an effect? Yes, there is a relationship between self-esteem in adolescence and performance at school, but we haven't quite figured out for sure which one comes first. Do adolescents increase in self-esteem when they do well in school? Or does having positive self-esteem positively influence academics performance in school? It's kind of difficult to figure out. It's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? So in the 60s and 70s, this was a very popular topic of research, thinking that, if we can actively do something to increase the self-esteem of students, then students will perform better academically speaking. And so that's where the focus was put, on helping students to feel better about themselves, encouraging a feeling of being capable. And they would be praised for doing well or simply for putting effort in, with the hope that doing this would help to raise self-esteem. And in raising their self-esteem, that would have a domino effect and improve their academic performance. This didn't have the desired effect. It certainly didn't cause any harm, but it didn't have the desired effect. Instead, more recently, we've generally come to the conclusion that school success, performing academically well in school, and having self-esteem that is positive are mutually reinforcing. Now, I can see this happening in real life because when a student of any age has difficulty in school, after a period of time, school becomes kind of automatically equated in their mind with negative feelings, negative thoughts, with bad things, with pessimism. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, meaning that they assume they're not going to do well, and that contributes to them failing in various ways. Now, there could be a flip side to this too, couldn't there? Because we could say, well, then isn't it possible for self-esteem to be too high as well as too low for a young person? Could somebody have inflated self-esteem for whatever reason that causes problems? And I'm sorry, I just could not resist this cartoon. This is one of my favorite cartoons ever. Well, maybe as an example, I'm thinking of the Little Emperor syndrome that evolved in China due to its one-child policy, where for several generations, young male children were so spoiled and coddled and catered to that they really became like little emperors in their own family. Many in that generation have had great difficulty with basic social skills, in part because they were raised to firmly believe that everything should revolve around them. So when you have a room full of people all raised the same way, every person's expecting everything to revolve around them. Now, what about emerging adulthood? What happens with self-esteem there? Well, as I've said, for most people, self-esteem in emerging adulthood tends to improve. This doesn't mean feeling 100% great about yourself all the time, but it does mean an improvement. And there are several reasons for this. If you think of the difference between adolescence and emerging adulthood. Nope, sorry, let me pause it. I apologize. My dog started to bark and I couldn't get to the pause button quick enough. So if you think of what has occurred in emerging adulthood compared to adolescence, by emerging adulthood, most people have passed through the most awkward stages and phases of puberty, and they're more comfortable with how they look. So it doesn't mean you're completely satisfied, but a lot of the awkwardness and adjustments that go with adolescence have resolved themselves and faded at this point. So girls have adjusted to having their period every month. Their development has evened out and they've adjusted to having a more womanly body. For boys, their growth has evened out, so they're not all arms and legs and quite so uncoordinated. They've adjusted to being more masculine in appearance. They've adjusted to having the people around them treat them more like adults, as more mature. And they've adjusted, at least in part, to different expectations of themselves. So if you think of the comparison between a grade 7 class and a grade 12 class or high school graduates, that's a huge difference. So things have generally evened out for them by this point.